Imagine you are on a boat in the middle of the night, and the storm is so violent that the panic of the others around you becomes deafening. The wind is screaming in your face. The waves rise like walls, towering over you, as if they carry the full weight of your worst fears. Now bring that scene into your life today. The storm is no longer water. It's the bank freezing your accounts. It's the doctor handing you a diagnosis you weren't ready to hear. It's your business collapsing in front of you. It's your relationship falling apart piece by piece. The panic is still there. Your senses are screaming the same thing. It's over. This is the end. You're going under. So what do you do in that exact moment? Because that moment reveals everything. You were taught to react a certain way. To beg, to panic, to collapse emotionally and hope something external saves you. You were taught to wait for relief. But if you look carefully, that pattern doesn't create stability. It creates dependence. It keeps you reacting instead of responding. Now look at the contrast. In the middle of chaos, there is a moment described where everything shifts. Not because the storm disappears instantly, but because someone inside the storm does not match its energy. Instead of amplifying the panic, instead of feeding the fear, there is a pause, a reset, a controlled response. That's the part most people miss. The power is not in controlling the storm, it's in not becoming the storm. Because the moment you mirror chaos, you lose your ability to deal with it. But the moment you stay grounded, something changes. Not outside first, inside. Your breathing slows, your thinking clears, your perception stabilizes, and suddenly what felt overwhelming becomes something you can actually face. This is where the real protocol begins. Not mystical, not magical, but practical and demanding. Because most people fail at the first step. They absorb everything around them, the fear of others, the noise, the urgency. They let the external environment dictate their internal state. And once that happens, they're no longer in control. So the first shift is isolation. Not physical isolation, mental isolation. You separate your internal state from what's happening around you. You stop feeding on panic. You stop reinforcing fear through repetition. You stop replaying the same worst-case scenario over and over again. You create distance inside your own mind. This doesn't mean ignoring reality. It means refusing to let it destabilize you. Because if your internal state collapses, your ability to respond collapses with it. Then comes the second shift, clarity in communication. Not long speeches, not emotional reactions, simple, direct, grounded language. Instead of saying everything is falling apart, you narrow your focus. This is the problem, I'm dealing with it. That sentence alone changes your state. It removes exaggeration. It removes helplessness. It replaces it with direction. And direction is what your brain needs to move. Without it, you stay stuck. Then comes the hardest part, consistency. Because reality doesn't always respond immediately. Problems don't disappear the moment you become calm. And this is where most people break. They stabilize for a moment, then look back at the situation. And when they don't see instant change, they collapse again. They go back to panic, back to doubt, back to reacting. But this is where real control is built, not in the first response, but in the sustained one. You hold your state. You don't keep checking every second for confirmation. You don't let temporary resistance pull you back into chaos. You stay steady long enough to think clearly and act effectively. Because most situations don't require magic. They require clarity, consistency, and action. But none of those are possible if your internal system is unstable. There's something else most people never consider. Sometimes the real obstacle isn't outside, it's internal. Old resentment, unresolved frustration, lingering anger, these states don't just sit quietly in the background. They affect how you interpret everything. They distort your reactions. They lower your tolerance for pressure. So even if you try to stay calm externally, internally there is tension, and that tension leaks into your behavior, into your decisions, into your results. Which means real control requires something deeper. Not just changing how you speak in the moment, but addressing what you're carrying over time. Because unresolved internal weight makes every external problem heavier. And once you start seeing that clearly, you stop looking for quick fixes. You stop expecting instant transformation. You start building something more stable, more reliable, something that holds even when things get difficult. And from that point on, the storm doesn't define you anymore. It tests you. And every time you go through it without collapsing, you reinforce a new pattern, a stronger one. So before you leave this moment, pause for a second. Not to react, not to rush, but to recognize something simple. The situation may not be under your control, but your response is. And that response, repeated over time, is what determines where you end up. So the next time the pressure hits and everything around you starts to spiral, you'll recognize it. The noise, the urgency, the instinct to panic. And right there, you'll have the same choice. Join the chaos, or stay grounded enough to move through it. Because in the end, that's what separates those who sink from those who find a way to navigate the storm. And once you learn how to stay steady, even when everything else isn't, you stop waiting for calm waters and start becoming someone who can handle them. And this is where the real difference is revealed. Not when everything is already collapsing, but in the seconds right before you react. Because that's where the pattern lives. That automatic surge of thoughts, that pressure building in your chest, that instinct to speak, to complain, to predict the worst outcome. It feels immediate. It feels uncontrollable. But it's not. It's conditioned. Your mind is trying to protect you. It scans the situation, compares it to past experiences, and then generates a response based on what it believes is most likely to happen. And if your past is filled with moments where things went wrong, your brain will lean toward that direction. Not because it wants to hurt you, but because it wants to prepare you. The problem is, preparation based on fear often creates paralysis. You start thinking too much, you delay decisions, you avoid action. And in trying to protect yourself from failure, you move closer to it. This is why controlling your response is not optional. It's essential. Because if you don't intervene, your brain will run the same script again and again and again. Now think about that moment in the storm. Not the waves, not the wind, but the internal shift. The moment where instead of reacting like everyone else, you pause, you breathe, you separate yourself from the noise. That pause is not weakness, it's control. Most people rush to speak, to react, to release tension. But in doing that, they lock themselves into the same emotional loop. They reinforce the panic. They make it stronger. But when you hold that pause, even for a second longer than usual, you interrupt the cycle. And in that interruption, you gain access to something most people lose under pressure. Choice. Choice of how to interpret what's happening. Choice of how to describe it. Choice of what to do next. And from there, everything starts to change. Not instantly, not dramatically, but steadily. Instead of saying, "This is impossible," you shift to, "This is difficult, but I'll figure out the next move." Instead of, "I'm done," you shift to, "This isn't over yet." Those sentences might seem small, but they stabilize your system. They keep your mind engaged. They keep you moving. Because the moment you label something as impossible, your brain stops searching for solutions. It shuts down, it protects energy, and you lose access to options that were there all along. But when your language stays open, grounded, directed, your brain keeps working. It keeps scanning. It keeps trying to solve. And that's where real movement happens. Not in perfect conditions, but in imperfect situations. handled with a stable mindset. There's another detail that becomes clear as you practice this. You stop needing immediate answers. You stop needing everything to be resolved right away, because you trust your ability to handle what comes next. That trust doesn't come from confidence alone. It comes from repetition, from seeing yourself respond differently over and over again, from proving to yourself that you don't collapse the same way anymore. And once that trust builds, something shifts internally. You become less reactive, less fragile, less dependent on external outcomes to feel stable. You don't panic as easily. You don't overthink as deeply. You don't attach to worst-case scenarios as quickly. Not because life got easier, but because you became stronger in how you process it. And that strength shows up in subtle ways, in how you speak, in how you think, in how you carry yourself when things aren't going your way. People might not even notice it directly, but they feel it, because stability stands out in a world full of reaction. And over time, that stability becomes your default. Not something you force, not something you remember to do, but something that happens naturally. And when you reach that point, the storm doesn't disappear, but it stops controlling you. You're no longer at the mercy of every wave, every gust, every unexpected shift. You adapt, you adjust, you move. And that's what allows you to navigate situations that once would have overwhelmed you. Because in the end, it's not the intensity of the storm that determines the outcome. It's the stability of the person inside it. And this is where something even more subtle begins to emerge. Because once you stop reacting automatically, you start noticing things you never saw before. Details, patterns, opportunities that were always there but hidden behind noise. When your mind is in chaos, your perception narrows. You only see the threat. You only hear the urgency. You only feel the pressure. Everything else disappears. But when your internal state stabilizes, your perception expands. You start seeing options. You start identifying what actually matters and what doesn't. And you begin to separate the signal from the noise. And that alone changes the way you operate. Because most mistakes are not made from lack of intelligence. They're made from lack of clarity under pressure. Think about how many times people make decisions in panic. They rush, they assume, they act without thinking. And later, they realize the situation wasn't as extreme as it felt. But by then, the damage is already done. Not because of the problem itself, but because of the reaction to it. When you remove that reactive layer, you give yourself something rare: time, even if it's just a few seconds. And in those seconds, you can think, you can evaluate, you can choose a response that actually moves you forward. This is where control becomes real, not in stopping problems, but in improving how you move through them. There's another shift that happens at this stage. You stop personalizing everything. Not every problem is an attack. Not every setback is failure. Not every delay is the end of something. But when your internal language is unstable, everything feels personal. Everything feels heavy. Everything feels like proof that something is wrong. And that weight slows you down. It drains your energy. It keeps you stuck in cycles that repeat over and over again. But when you start seeing situations more clearly, without exaggeration, without distortion, you remove that unnecessary weight. Now you're dealing with reality, not your amplified version of it. And reality, most of the time, is far more manageable than the story we create about it. This is also where emotional control deepens, not by suppressing emotions, but by not letting them dictate everything. You still feel pressure, you still feel uncertainty, but you don't let those feelings take over your decisions. You acknowledge them, and then you move anyway. That ability separates people more than talent ever will. Because most people wait to feel ready. They wait to feel confident. They wait for the fear to disappear. But that moment rarely comes. So they stay stuck. Not because they can't move, but because they don't trust themselves to move while feeling uncomfortable. When you build this internal stability, that changes. You stop waiting. You start acting, even when things are not perfect, even when there's uncertainty, even when there's risk. And with every action taken from that place, you reinforce something powerful. That you are not dependent on ideal conditions, that you can operate regardless of what's happening around you. And that realization changes everything, because once you understand that, you stop fearing situations as much. You stop avoiding challenges. You stop hesitating at every sign of difficulty. Not because you believe everything will work out perfectly, but because you trust your ability to handle whatever comes next. And that trust is built through repetition, through showing up differently, through responding differently, over and over again, until one day you don't even recognize the old version of yourself, the one that panicked quickly, the one that overreacted, the one that got overwhelmed by things that now feel manageable. And that's when the shift becomes permanent. Not because you forced it, but because you replaced the old pattern completely. At that point, you don't need to remind yourself to stay calm. You don't need to think about controlling your words. You don't need to consciously slow yourself down. It just happens. Because your system has been rewired through repetition, through awareness, through deliberate choice. And from there, you move through life differently, more stable, more precise, more resilient. Not because the storms stopped coming, but because you learned how to stand in the middle of them without losing yourself. And when you reach that level, something quiet but undeniable settles inside you. Not excitement, not intensity, not even confidence in the way people usually describe it. Something deeper. Stability. A kind of internal stillness that doesn't disappear the moment things go wrong. A center that holds, even when everything around you doesn't. At this point, you no longer look at difficult situations the same way. You don't immediately label them as threats. You don't rush to escape them. You don't let them define what happens next. You see them for what they are. Situations, events, moments that require a response. And because your response is no longer automatic, it becomes intentional. You take a step back, you assess, you decide. That space between what happens and what you do, that's where your power is. Most people never access it because they fill it instantly, with fear, with assumptions, with reactions they've repeated their entire lives. But you don't fill it anymore. You hold it, you use it. And in that space, you operate differently. You speak with purpose, not to release emotion, but to create direction. You think with clarity, not to justify fear, but to find solutions. You act with control, not to escape discomfort, but to move through it. And over time, that way of operating becomes your identity. You're no longer someone trying to stay calm. You're someone who is calm under pressure. You're no longer someone trying to think clearly. You're someone who thinks clearly, even when things are uncertain. And that distinction matters, because identity is what sustains behavior. Once something becomes who you are, it no longer depends on effort. It no longer depends on motivation. It becomes automatic. And that's when the real transformation is complete. Not when everything in your life is perfect, but when you no longer need it to be in order to function at a high level. Because now your stability comes from within, not from outcomes, not from circumstances, not from temporary wins or losses. And that makes you difficult to shake, difficult to overwhelm, difficult to stop. Not because you're invincible,
but because you're no longer fragile. And from that place, you move differently. You decide differently. You persist differently. You stop chasing control over everything and start mastering control over what actually matters. Your focus, your reactions, your words, your next move. And in the end, that's what shapes your life. Not one moment, not one decision, but the accumulation of how you show up again and again. So when the next storm comes, and you won't need to wonder what to do. You'll recognize the moment, the pressure, the noise, the pull to react. And instead of being carried by it, you'll stand, steady, aware, in control of yourself. And that's when everything changes. Because at that point, it's no longer about stopping the storm. It's about knowing that no matter how strong it gets,
You're not the one who breaks. And once you reach that point, there is one last realization that changes everything. The storm was never the real test, not the pressure, not the uncertainty, not even the outcome. The real test was always you. Because every situation you face exposes something. How you think, how you react, how you interpret what's happening. It reveals the structure you've built inside yourself. And for most people, that structure is fragile, built on reaction, built on fear, built on patterns they never questioned. So when pressure comes, it doesn't just challenge them, it breaks them. But when you've done the work, when you've rebuilt your patterns, when you've trained your response instead of letting it run on autopilot, the same pressure reveals something different. It reveals control, not control over everything, but control where it matters. Your thoughts don't spiral the same way. Your words don't collapse into panic. Your actions don't freeze under uncertainty. You stay present. You stay engaged. You stay capable. And that's when you understand something most people never fully grasp. Strength is not loud. It's not dramatic. It doesn't need to prove itself. Real strength is quiet. It shows up in how you handle moments that used to overwhelm you. It shows up in what you don't do anymore. The reactions you no longer have. The patterns you no longer repeat. And that's where your power becomes undeniable. Not because you control outcomes, but because outcomes no longer control you. You stop being pulled in every direction. You stop being defined by every setback. You stop giving every situation the power to dictate how you feel, think, and act. Instead, you move with intention, even when things are unclear, even when results take time, even when the path is not perfect. And that consistency, that ability to remain stable over time, is what creates real change. Because most people don't fail from lack of effort. They fail from inconsistency, from reacting differently every time pressure appears, from losing control in small moments that add up. But when your internal system is stable, your behavior becomes consistent. And consistency is what builds results, not instantly, not magically, but reliably. And over time, that reliability compounds. What once felt difficult becomes manageable. What once felt impossible becomes something you navigate. What once stopped you no longer does. And that's when your relationship with challenges changes completely. You stop seeing them as threats to avoid and start seeing them as situations to move through, because you've already proven to yourself that you don't break the same way anymore. And that proof becomes your foundation, not belief, not hope. Evidence built through repetition, through showing up differently, through choosing better responses again and again, until one day, you don't even think about it anymore. You don't need to remind yourself to stay grounded. You don't need to force control. You don't need to fight your own reactions, because you've already done that work. And now, it's just how you operate. At that point, there's nothing left to chase, nothing left to prove, only something to maintain: clarity, stability, control over yourself. And from there, everything you build becomes stronger, more intentional, more aligned with how you actually want to live. So when you look back at who you were before all of this, The difference won't just be in what you achieved. It will be in how you think, how you speak, how you move through moments that used to stop you. And that's the real transformation. Not becoming someone new, but becoming someone who is no longer controlled by what used to control them. And once you reach that level, there is no storm strong enough to take that away from you. And after all of that, there is one final shift that most people never talk about. Because it's not dramatic. It doesn't look powerful from the outside. But internally, it changes everything. You stop needing the storm. At the beginning, every challenge feels like something you have to survive. Then, as you grow, it becomes something you learn to handle. But at this level, you no longer rely on chaos to prove your strength. You don't need pressure to feel in control. You don't need problems to activate your focus. You don't need things to go wrong to remind yourself who you are. Because your state is no longer reactive. It's consistent. Most people only access clarity when things fall apart. Only access focus when they're forced to. Only access discipline when there's no other option. But when you've built this internal structure, you don't wait for those moments anymore. You bring that same clarity into normal days. You bring that same control into simple decisions. You bring that same awareness into moments that most people overlook. And that's where your life really starts to change. Not in the extremes, but in the ordinary. Because the way you handle small moments is what defines how you handle big ones. If your default state is stable, you don't need to switch on under pressure. You're already there. And that removes something that used to slow you down. Friction, the hesitation, the overthinking, the internal conflict between what you know you should do and what you feel like doing. That gap gets smaller until eventually it disappears. And when that happens, your actions become cleaner, faster, more precise. You decide and you move without dragging doubt behind you, without replaying the same thoughts over and over again. And that level of clarity creates momentum, not forced momentum, not rushed, but steady, controlled, sustainable. And that's what most people are missing. They look for intensity, for motivation, for something that pushes them temporarily. But what actually builds results is consistency without resistance, the ability to move forward without constantly fighting yourself. And that only happens when your internal system is aligned. When your thoughts, your words, and your actions are no longer pulling in different directions. At that point, you're not just reacting better, you're operating better. Everything becomes simpler. Not easier, but clearer. You know what matters. You know what doesn't. You know when to act. You know when to wait. And because of that, you waste less energy, less time, less attention on things that don't move you forward. That efficiency compounds. Over time, it separates you from who you used to be and from most people around you. Not in a loud way, not in a way that needs recognition, but in results, in stability, in how you carry yourself through situations that used to feel overwhelming. And eventually, you realize something that closes the entire loop. You were never trying to control the outside world. You were learning how to stop letting it control you. And once that happens, the need to force outcomes disappears. The need to react disappears. The need to prove anything disappears. You just move with clarity, with intention, with control over what actually belongs to you. Your focus, your decisions, your actions. And from there, life doesn't become perfect, but it becomes manageable, navigable, structured. And that changes everything, because at the end of it all, the goal was never to eliminate storms. It was to become someone who doesn't get lost in them. And once you become that person, it doesn't matter what shows up next. You'll meet it the same way. Steady, clear, unshaken, and moving forward. And now, everything comes together.
Not as an idea, not as something you need to remember, but as something you've already seen unfold step by step. You started with reaction, with noise, with patterns you didn't question, with responses that felt automatic and uncontrollable. Then came awareness. You began to notice the pause, the moment before the reaction, the space where everything could change if you chose differently. Then came control. Not perfect, not immediate, but real. You interrupted patterns. You changed your language. You stabilized your response, even when it felt unnatural. Then came repetition. And through repetition, you stopped forcing it. You stopped thinking about it. You became it. And now, you stand in a completely different place. Not above problems, not outside reality, but grounded inside it. The storms still come. The pressure still appears. The unexpected still happens. But you don't collapse the same way. You don't amplify what's already difficult. You don't turn moments into chaos. You don't lose yourself in reactions that don't serve you. You stay present, aware, in control of what actually matters. And that changes everything, because at this level, you don't need perfect conditions to move forward. You don't need certainty to act. You don't need guarantees to stay steady. You've removed the dependency. And without that dependency, there is freedom. Freedom from overreaction, freedom from hesitation, freedom from patterns that used to repeat without question. You're no longer waiting for things to get easier. You've become someone who can handle them as they are. And that is where real power exists. Not in controlling outcomes, but in no longer being controlled by them. So from this point on, there's nothing left to unlock. Nothing hidden, nothing mysterious, only something to live. Every moment you speak, every moment you react, every moment you choose, you reinforce who you've become. And the more you reinforce it, the more natural it feels. The more stable it becomes, the more unshakable you become. Until one day, you don't even think about storms the same way anymore. Because you already know, no matter how strong they get, you're not the one who breaks. And from there, there's only one direction left: forward.